Okay, good morning. It's great to see everyone, and welcome to the fifth meeting of the Acquisition Sketch Project, the first one in 2024. And we are super happy to welcome you all today to talk about data processing. So maybe I should share my slides. All right, let's start by sharing my slides. And so we will focus today on the setup that you select for processing the data, selecting transcribers. Whoops, you're seeing the wrong display, right? Okay, now you're seeing the right display. Good. Selecting transcribers, segmenting the data, and selecting what tiers to use. And so my plan is to go through each one of these and then have a little bit of question and discussion at the end of each section because they're quite different themes. Okay, sound good? Super. So, yeah, that's the agenda for today. Cool. So, first of all, selecting a setup. There are two common setups in let me just get rid of this hide for meeting controls. Okay, there are two common setups that people use to process the data. One is ELAN that's typically used in language documentation, and the other is chat that's typically used in child language acquisition. So Lucy, who's on our call, has used ELAN a lot and is an expert with that. And I have used chat, and there's several other people here have used chat too. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about each. ELAN, as I said, is typically used in language documentation, and the ELAN program itself, you can transcribe the data in, but then people also use either Toolbox or Fieldworks, which are additional programs that integrate into ELAN to manage the morphemes and glosses, etc. The ELAN was designed particularly for video data, so it shows the sound waves in the video on the screen and was designed for that. And an important thing for me is that the tiers of data that you have can be hierarchically connected, which is not true of chat. If you're using video data, like if you want to code video data like gesture, for example, then ELAN is probably your best bet. And I'll show a couple of examples of it in a moment. The chat transcription system is part of the CHILDIS project, the Child Language Data Exchange System. So it was originally designed for transcribing child language, and it has evolved such that now it also shows sound waves and videos on the screen. And Abdul, who's on our call, has used it with sound and video, so maybe he can say a bit about that. The tiers are not hierarchically connected, so you have to figure out how to manage that within individual tiers, which we can talk about. I think it's relatively easier to learn and use, but of course, if you're going to be using this for 2 or 3 years, a little bit more time to learn to use it doesn't matter that much. One advantage of chat is that it has a dedicated set of analysis tools specific to child language research questions, the CLAN tools, child language analysis. So that could be good. All right, so what do they look like? Whoops. All right, so here is the ELAN homepage. And so you can see from here that it has a whole introduction with some examples and a description and the main features of it. And it also has documentation and support and resources. So there's a lot of support for ELAN. It was designed from the Max Planck of psycholinguistics in Nijmegen. And here is an example from Lucy. And Lucy, maybe you could talk us through sort of how this is structured and works.
Yeah, sure. So as you can see, there are two videos here showing different angles. You could just have one video. You could also have no video if you wanted to, but the video is great. It's all time aligned with the audio and the all the transcriptions and everything. you can see on the left, there are only it looks like there are only 3 tiers per participant. There are a lot more than that, I assure you. You can just show more or fewer, which is really good for just ease of working with it. So you select the tiers that you're working on at the time, and then you don't need to see the other ones. Otherwise, you can have lots and lots of tiers, so it can be a bit messy. You can also, on the top right, you can see that, so Acacia is one of the focus children, one of the participants, and I've got her, so PO is practical orthography. So that's what she said throughout the entire recording. So if I'm focusing on her, I can track it that way as well. And you can switch that to any tier you want. I personally haven't used any of the other things up there actually, because they're not a key. Maybe they are a key aspect of Elan to some people, but I don't find it. I find the grid, this function that you can see there, really useful, but the others I haven't had to use. But yeah, I highly recommend Elan. I haven't used the other, but I find it user friendly. There's lots of, as Shamli said, there are a lot of resources online, lots of forums and things, so you can find a lot of information if you need some help.
So just looking at this, I would say one advantage over chat is probably that in chat you can't select, as far as I know, which tiers to show at any given time. You see everything at once. And so that might be an advantage if you have a lot of tiers. And I don't think in chat you can have this thing on the top right where you're just seeing one tier for one person over. I can really see that that would be a great advantage if you're looking at the context or something and you want to see, what the
Exactly. Yeah. In another project, I was looking at reference tracking in a narrative, and so I had that tier coding that coded the particular types of reference up there in the grid, and so I could just flick through the recording to each one, which was really useful.
Yeah.
I guess here also, Lucy, you've got a multi-party conversation going on. So you've got multiple speaker tiers, and then to be able to get Acacia's utterances by themselves is something that's a feature of Elan, but not a feature to my knowledge of Chat or Clan as well.
And you can see like the columns of stuff moving along. You see the utterances in columns moving along, and I think that's not true of chat either. Okay, so this is a great example of Elan. And whoops, there. This is the Childus homepage. So you can see that Childus also has a lot of resources. It started in the early 1980s and has evolved a lot over time into, so it was the central thing and now has evolved into this TalkBank system that has databases for second language acquisition and conversational analysis and all sorts of other things. But here we see, for example, the manuals for the chat transcription and the Clan analysis program. It has tutorial screencasts, and it also has a lot of data from a whole bunch of languages in this format, so you can compare with your own data or whatever. It has a morphology loss producer for, well, clearly for English, and I guess a system to create one for other languages. Anyway, it also has lots of resources and has a Google group as well for support. That's pretty responsive. And so here is an example of chat, and this is from Abdul. So maybe Abdul, if you would talk us through what's going on here, that would be great.
Hi, yeah, so this is some data that we collected in Morocco for a speaker of Tashlahit Berber. And you can see that both the audio sound waves and the video can be visible while you're transcribing. And you have the father with multiple tiers, morphology, phonology. So that's IPA transcription as well. And I think that's everything that is visible here. Yeah.
Cool. So you didn't used to be able to use chat with video at all, and as you see here, you can use it. I don't know if you can have more than one perspective, but anyway, you can have video and you see the audio track, but not the utterances lined up with the audio like we had in Elan. But anyway, and then you see the various tiers there. So I realize I should introduce people maybe a little bit more. Abdul Latik is a student at the Max Planck Institute for Psycholinguistics doing an acquisition sketch on Berber. And as far as I know, he's finished transcribing with the morphology and phonology tier already and is doing a bunch of analysis. So that's very exciting. So if you're looking for someone right in the midst of doing an acquisition sketch, go to Abdul. And Lucy Davidson is one of the authors on the sketch acquisition manual, and she is a postdoc, right, or research scientist at the University of Melbourne. Is that true?
Yeah, postdoc, yeah.
Has been working with Muran Pata and I think other Australian Aboriginal languages for quite a long time. So she also has lots of experience. Okay, and thank you both for participating today. Okay, so those are the two typical formats that are used in child language and that we suggest for putting your data in for the acquisition sketch. And when you're choosing between, I think helpful questions to ask are, what setup do you already know? Obviously, if you already know one of them, that would be a good reason to go for it. Or what setup do you have support for? Do you have a colleague that's willing to help you? So my student Dorjo, who is working on Mongolian, met Abdul at a conference a few months ago, and Abdul has been extremely helpful in getting him set up to do all the transcription with the audio and everything using chat. And that's made all the difference, I would say, for him. So if you have a relationship like that, then definitely go for that. What setup is common in your subfield? As I said, in child language, chat is common. In language documentation, Elan is more common. So that might have an effect. Is annotating video important for you? So if you want to do anything detailed with video like gesture, then Elan is probably the best bet because chat can do it, but I don't know how much coding within the video you can do, etc., whereas Elan is specifically designed for that. Then is annotating phonetics important for you? I have, so chat has the Fawn addition to it that's specifically designed for phonetics, and you can integrate Pratt into chat. I don't know if that's true for Elan as well. Is that true for Elan too? How do you, can you do essay transcription in Elan or?
I think you can connect Pratt to it, but I actually haven't done that. I think you can connect Pratt.
It is possible, but I think it's easier with chat. It's there is better compatibility, and well, I also talked to Ivan Rose, Phone's creator, a couple of weeks ago, and he said it's going to be like they're working on a second version of Phone, and it's going to be even more compatible with chat. So I think if you're doing anything with phonology, I think chat is the best option.
Okay, so we have an example a bit later from Cree, which is the language that Yvon used to design Fawn. So we'll see how Fawn works. So, and then what programs or procedures will you use to analyze the data? So as I said, Chat has the CLAN programs available. For Elan, then you use Toolbox or Fieldworks, which they're not specifically designed for child language, but I presume one can tweak them well for child language. Do you want to say more about that, Lucy?
Yeah, they work fine enough. I have to admit that I personally have done very little glossing in. I've never used Fieldworks or Flex, as it's also referred to. I've used Toolbox a bit, but I outsourced the glossing in Fieldworks to an RA. And so with our Murimpata project, some of it is glossed in Toolbox, and another person on the project used Toolbox. So the recordings that he glossed, they're done with Toolbox and they're great. And then, yeah, we outsourced the rest and someone used Fieldworks and they're great too. So I personally don't have much to say about it, but they seem compatible enough. I can't compare with chat though.
Yeah, I think one thing is important to say about that is my experience is largely with Clan and chat, and that does provide a kind of powerful way to analyze the corpus. My experience, and Marowina might be able to jump in here with the Tagalog as what Marowina's experience, I should say, is that when things are in ELAN, what we did or what Rowena did was analyze stuff using R. So we didn't use any of the analysis tools because I don't think they would have been particularly good for our research questions that we were asking. But I'll hand it over to Rowena.
But that's definitely the case from ELAN. It was rather easy to export it as a text file. So we took it out of ELAN, got it still in tiers. There are many options what you want to export. You could also say, I only want this participant. I only want this tier. I want it with millisecond duration. So there are many options for exporting it, and then we process them in R further.
So could you do like mean length of utterance straightforwardly?
So actually for this, I guess it could also work. And then you will do it in R in this sense of if there's a space, count that as maybe a single word, but with the morphemes. I guess it depends on how it was coded. For us, actually, as much as we were using ELAN, we actually transcribe it using the chat format. So in our theoretically, we have also done that. You can export it from ELAN into a CHA file, and then we ran it there. There we could also do this of types, tokens, so that we kind of combined the two for an analysis like that. But I think it's possible with MLU as well. It's just that I guess it depends on how they're transcribed. For example, for the chat format, there are sometimes spaces to indicate, for example, if an actual word really meant something, there would be a colon space, and then maybe that messes up with how it will be in RStudio for doing a mean length MLU calculation. But I can imagine because it's systematic, you could always just pre-process it of, okay, remove all of these and then do something like that. But for us, it was kind of helpful that we could export it as a text file and also as a CHA file.
Mhm.
And that's something to think about when Sagal also asked in the chat as well, is there compatibility between ELAN and chat? And so my understanding is that there's more compatibility one way from ELAN to chat if you transcribe in chat format like Rowena just referred to, yeah, rather than going from chat to ELAN.
Mhm. Yeah, that's what I think too. So I think detailed questions of like, what's the right thing for my project, given this and this and this criteria, that's probably too much to discuss right now. But this is definitely the kind of thing that you want to be thinking about. Like, what are the things what are your research questions? What are the things that you want to be able to code? What are you using, etc. Okay, that's all I wanted to say about selecting setup. Does anyone have some questions or want to say more things, or just jump in? I don't see everybody, so you can put up your hand or whatever. Anyone?
One tiny extra thing about ELAN that I found really useful when transcribing, I don't know if you can do it with Clan and Chat, is the playback feature, and you make a selection and you can just play that utterance or phrase again and again and again, which I found really useful. I don't know if you can do it with the other.
Abdul, can you do that with Chat too?
Yes, I think once you have a time point, let's say you have a line and you have the time point selected, you can play back the same selection many times using F8. Yeah.
Cool. Okay, then let us go on to selecting and training transcribers. So the typical choices for transcribers are you as the researcher on the project, or caregivers, maybe the caregiver that participated in the session, or family members of the child. And that could happen either alone, you give them the data and say, here, transcribe, or sitting together with you and doing it together. And then other community members that are speakers of the language that could do it again alone or together with you. So those are the typical choices. And it also could be helpful to get help from older children that might understand the situation better or the child's language better, or the target child themselves. You could get them to say, hey, what were you saying here? Or hey, could you say this again? Or something like that. That might be helpful. So the typical criteria you're going for in selecting transcribers, obviously the person should be a fluent speaker of the language and able to understand the child's speech. So that means somebody that is familiar with the child or with the family or with children of that age would be a good candidate. And knowledge of the child's daily context, the kinds of things that either happen in that particular household or a typical household like that, to know what's typically going on in a daily situation is very useful. Able to write the language if that is possible, and ideally using a computer if that's possible. That has sufficient time and patience to complete the job. So transcribing takes a lot of time. There are lots of ways that you can support someone if they have less time or less patience. And obviously you don't need to have the same person transcribing all 5 hours of your data. You can have a different person transcribing each one of the 30-minute sessions, like the mother of that child or whatever. And should be someone that's acceptable to the family, because they're going to be seeing data that's probably been collected in that person's home, and not everybody wants every possible member of their community seeing data that was from their home or whatever. I realize now that I didn't think about that at all. I just had whoever I could transcribing the data, so that's probably not good. So these are the typical criteria and choices. Here are some examples from different projects of what people had done. So I collected data from Inuktitut in communities that are 1,000 miles north of Montreal. And then I had people transcribe them who were college students that were studying in Montreal, but from those communities or neighboring communities. And that were looking for work in Montreal. And I had them all come to my office area. I created one room just for the transcribers, and it had a nice garden out behind. And so there would be 2 or 3 of them there sitting at a desk transcribing at the same time. And I think that was helpful because it provided a sense of community for them. I think transcribing can be very boring, and you need a lot of patience to sit at it yourself for a long time. And I think having them come together in a nice place right in downtown Montreal and working together, in retrospect, I think that was motivating for them to actually get the job done. And then it also gave them some work when they were living alone in Montreal, studying and whatever, so it helped to support them too. So that was my situation. In the Cree project, Abdul mentioned Yvon Rose that created FAWN. He was involved in that project, and Julie Bertain ran the project, or is still running it. There, they had a project manager in the community who served as the interlocutor for all the recordings, and she transcribed all the data. And I believe that she met with Julie sometimes in the community, sometimes in St. John's, Newfoundland, where Julie was based, to go through and answer questions and discuss problems and whatever. And then they have a complete IPA transcription for the data, which they had students at the university do who were trained in Cree phonology but didn't speak Cree at all. And so they separated that work. I'll just finish this slide and then come to your question, Sigal. For Mongolian, my student who's collecting data for the acquisition sketch now, he is doing half the transcription himself, and then he found a master's student in psychology who wanted to get experience in child language development, and so he's doing the other half of the transcription, and they're going to transcribe some of the data together and compare their reliability or whatever. For Sesotho, Catherine Demuth had the mother of each child work with her. So I believe she and the mother sat together, and Catherine did the typing, and the mother told her, what was being said, and then they worked on it together and checked it like that. So that can also be very productive. In Sabina Stoll's project in Sintang, there were a number of community members who actually had degrees in linguistics from the local university, and they did the transcription. So there's lots of different possibilities, and it's very dependent on what's available in your own situation. Sigal?
Yes, my question relates to cases where you have multiple transcribers. How do you mentioned it briefly, but how do you make sure they are consistent and they all transcribe the same way, especially in languages that are different from English and require some special characters?
Very good. So I have a slide on that in a moment. So save your question for after that slide. Okay.
I don't know how to cancel now the
okay.
The hand raise.
I can cancel it for you. Okay. Does anybody want to jump in and say what they did in their project that's different from this that might be helpful?
I can just wasn't my project, but I know that Alan Rumsey had community members, because it's just in Papua New Guinea and they didn't have access to computers, so they would write it down in like exercise books. So they'd write their transcriptions down, and then he was able to transcribe it into a digital format here in Canberra. So there's kind of a low-tech solutions if there isn't access to electricity or computer resources.
Yeah. I had also at least one transcriber that didn't work on computer, and so I printed out sheets, like a template of all the tiers, and then just gave them the sheet and then had an RA put that into the computer. That's also totally possible.
We do just have a question here, Shanley. I don't know if we want to come back to it or answer it now. It's from Anna, and she says, in what format would you ask family members to transcribe their data?
So ideally in chat format or on ELAN. So ideally you would teach them the computer program and then get them to transcribe it there. Otherwise, what I did was have a VHS recorder and a VHS tape, and they played the tape and then just typed it into the computer or wrote it on this paper that I had. So that could work depending on, how computer literate people are.
There's apparently a more basic version of ELAN. I've never used it, but precisely for that purpose. That's possibly worth looking into.
Sigal?
Yes, I'm wondering if any of you have used any AI-assisted voice-to-text transcription tool.
Yeah, I've used it for
AI is getting popular, and maybe it can save a lot of time when you do the basic transcription. You can then go over it, but there are some. So what's your opinion about this?
I think that would be great. I've used Otter for interviews with my father about his life, but I tried it with interviewing my daughter in German, and it tried to type stuff in English. So the problem I would see is that these things are probably not trained for the languages that you're working on. But maybe, like if you're working in a big language like Bengali or something, maybe there's something that's trained for that. I don't know.
Yeah, just on that, I thought Brian McWhinney had some kind of function like that in chat, and claimed that it was pretty good, but I don't know how it works across different languages. as part of the Center of Excellence for Dynamics of Language, which Lucy and I were both a part of, there was a project called ELPIS. I'll try and find the GitHub site to and put it in the chat. And this was created for that specific purpose, so speech to text transcription, that aimed to be able to work on understudied languages. So I will look for that now, and I will put it in the chat for you. So, and let Shanley get on with her presentation.
Okay.
I'll quickly make a comment about oh no, hang on. I will quickly say transcription, the activity, because it is so time consuming and tedious and hard. So in Wadia, the community that I worked with Murimpat, the speakers in, I, similar to Catherine Demuth on Sisuto, I worked with the female caregivers, the primary caregivers of the children. And from almost all the women I worked with, so literacy levels are quite low in that community, or the women are just not confident enough that they might be okay with it, but they don't dare to say that they are. So it was me sitting with them, I was typing into the computer, and for lots of the women it was their first and only paid work they'd had, and I really wanted it to be a positive experience for them. And so in the end, for most of the sessions, I would actually take small family groups out for a little picnic. The kids would play off over there or come over and help us out when we needed them to. And it was just really nice. It was relaxed. We did a lot of work, but it just kind of it just made it more accessible an activity for these women who hadn't done paid work before and wouldn't know what to do, I'm sure, if they went into an office. So yeah, just wanted to make that. It is adaptable. You can do it in multiple places.
Super. Okay, so Sigal, you asked about how to support transcribers, and the next slide is a little bit about quality control. So the first thing is providing guidelines, like what to transcribe: child speech, caregiver speech, other people. What if there's a lot of people in the context? Do you want everything transcribed? So think a bit about that. How to divide intonation units or utterances in the segmentation part, where we'll talk about that. In language documentation, people divide on each line or each segment as an intonation unit. In child language, it's typically an utterance, but what is that? And so giving guidelines about that. What do you do with things like repetition or uninterpretable speech? That happens all the time in child language, so have some ideas in your guidelines what to do with that. Saying explicitly that you transcribe what the child actually says, not what you think they intend to say. That goes on a separate tier. So I had some situations where people transcribe, what they thought the child was trying to say, but wasn't what they were actually saying. And of course, that's exactly what you want, what they're actually saying, because you're going for the childlike language. Emphasizing the need for detail and quality and consistency as much as is reasonable in your situation. So you're not going for just get it through, done as fast as possible to have something on the page. Quality is really important, but how you can emphasize that is going to be really different in different situations. But anyway, you want some guidelines, maybe much more detailed for you than what you give to the transcriber themselves, but you need to train them in some way. And then the amount of support. Some people can work fully independently. Other people would require sitting together, like the situation that Lucy just described would make sense for them to be working together with the researcher. We found that when we asked people to do transcribing in the community, they just never got to it because, the weather was nice, so they had something else to do. All totally understandable. And that's why I think my situation of bringing people together to work in an office situation was helpful. So you could brainstorm ideas for motivation, either yourself or together with the transcribers. But just to say that these kinds of things are necessary, and so you need to think a little bit about what's going to work best for your project.
For Hebrew, if I may say something about Hebrew, we have some students who do the transcription, and we use a shared document in Google Drive where if they have a problem with one of the words or they're not sure, they can write it down, and then we discuss it and we write the agreed upon solution. And then if another transcriber encounters the same problem or the same question, they can go to this document and see what was decided, and then they can use that form. So even if you're not sitting in the same room, you can still share information, and it's also saved. So you want to go back and see how to write something, especially homonyms or this kind of stuff. You can do it using this Google Drive and Google Docs.
That's a very good idea. So that fits with what I wanted to say here about training sessions. So the more you can increase transcriber confidence and knowledge, the better, and the more you can give them a place to ask questions and feel like they're supported, the better. Also, journals might request some evidence of this kind of thing, and especially transcriber reliability. So I think having training sessions at the very beginning of transcription, if this is going to work in your site, and it sounds like it would in your Sigal, have all transcribers transcribe the same short portion and compare, like 1 minute or 2 minutes of data, and then compare and see where they're similar, see where they're different, discuss the differences and how to resolve those, add solutions to your guidelines document, and repeat that a couple of times until you have high consistency across transcribers, because just like with everything else, transcribing is relatively subjective, and you want everyone on your project as much as possible, which is not 100% with humans, but anyway, to be doing it in a similar way. And I think having a Google Doc online is a great solution. I mean, that's what we do with our other research projects. And so if that will work in your context, I think that's a wonderful solution. However, you can adapt that for other contexts. And if possible, it would be great to calculate transcriber agreement. So if you were doing this project in English, you would be expected to have pairs of transcribers blind transcribe, let's say 10% of the data, and then calculate a Cohen's d or provide information about percent agreement across like every agreement on every word or something like that. For some of our situations, that could be totally possible. Like my student in Mongolian is planning to do that. And sounds like Sigal, you could totally do that with your project. But for others, like Lucy's project, what she described, I guess that would be impossible. So it just depends on the field situation you're in, and we're all in really different situations. So I just wanted to put something like this out there and say, think about how you can best support the transcribers to get the highest quality of data you can, and also be thinking in advance. Journals may ask for something like this, and what will you provide? Or how will you argue that you can provide anything? Other questions on this, or comments or anything? Okay, then let's go on to segmenting the data. So you have to select from all of the data that you have collected and recorded what you're going to actually transcribe. And we suggest for the sketch project to transcribe a continuous chunk of 30 minutes. So we've suggested that you tape at least an hour from at each child and each age. And then how do you select that 30 minutes? You want to be going for the maximum amount of child and caregiver speech, because obviously that's what we're going to be studying. And ideally avoiding things like a lot of crying or a lot of adult-only talk, especially if there's a bunch of people in the context, or if there's distracting background noise, like there's a part where there's a motorcycle going up and down in front of the house, or the dishwasher's on, or whatever. One strategy for that, especially if you can see all the sound waves, is just to flip through your recording and see where there's dense parts of sound in the waves, but that may not be helpful because that may be crying or motorcycle or whatever. So you actually do have to either just listen to or watch the recording to find the part that's going to be the most productive 30 minutes. So the first step is to select that 30 minutes at each of the 5 ages for each of the 2 kids. And then prepare those selected portions for transcription. So prepare the audio or video files for your selected setup, however they need to be prepared to, and then integrate them into the setup, into the file or whatever, so they align properly. And then prepare the templates of tiers. So we'll see in a minute the different possible tiers, or you saw already for, like, Lucy had, I think, the transcription and maybe the intended, she had 3 lines for each person anyway, whatever they were. And Abdul had also the transcription, the phonology and the morphology. So prepare those tiers. Probably Ilan does that for you automatically. For chat, I believe you have to cut and paste, or there's probably some way to generate it automatically as well. And then if your transcriber is computer savvy, you can just say, okay, here's the data file, here's the setup, go, once you've gone through all the guidelines and training, of course. If they're less computer savvy or they have limited time or whatever, then you could segment small portions of speech, even each utterance or each intonation unit, for them in advance, so that they're not spending their time looking through, finding the words or finding the utterances or whatever. They're just going from segment to segment and transcribing that. You can even find parts that are repeated and have only one of those, not all of them, to reduce their time. So depending on your project and your situation, you can do anything from, like, here's the video, see you later, to segmenting every individual utterance or intonation unit and going with the transcriber through it. So again, you need to figure out what's appropriate for your situation. Here is an example from the KAKET corpus from PNG. So this is the initial segmentation that they did. So you see here a bunch of sound, and they segmented that out for the transcriber to work on. And then here in the second figure, you see that that ended up being, looks like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 intonation units, including this repetition here 4 times of this word. And so they could have, well, what they did was provide this and then end up with this version, but you could have already segmented the second version if you need that for your project. What I did was just say, here's the whole file, figure it out. And that worked. Again, so you have to figure out for your own project what is going to work best. And then I mentioned intonation unit versus utterance. So the intonation unit is the typical unit of analysis in language documentation. That's a segment of speech that occurs with a single prosodic contour that typically begins with some sort of pause and ends in some sort of clause final intonation, which may or may not be clear for your language what that is. Obviously, for English, people have done mountains of studies on it, but I guess for Murun Pata, we maybe don't know what clause final intonation looks like. And importantly, this is not necessarily identical with the syntactic unit, but often corresponds to a clause or a group of clauses. So it can be a single word, can be a full sentence or more. In child language, the typical unit is an utterance. That's a continuous piece of speech by one person, before or after which there's typically a pause or silence on the part of the speaker. And it's typically a syntactic unit of some sort. So again, it could be a single word or a full sentence, but it's typically makes some syntactic sense. And figuring out exactly what an intonation unit or an utterance could be the subject of an entire hour in itself. The chat manual in chapter 9 has a whole chapter about utterances. So that's another thing that you need to think about in preparing your project. What unit of segmentation are you going to use, and what training are you going to give on that? Or are you just going to decide yourself and then have the people transcribe whatever you decide? Why should we care about these units? Because a number of the analyses depend on these units. For example, mean length of utterance depends on you having transcribed things in utterances. If you haven't, then it's a bit, then how can you have a mean length of utterance? Okay, helpful tips. Child language is often repetitive, so plan from the beginning how you're going to deal with repetitions. Are you going to transcribe those as one unit always? Are you going to decide each case depending on the intonation? You need from the beginning to have something about that as part of your guidelines, because you're going to encounter it zillions of times. Also, child language is often hard to interpret, so plan from the beginning strategies for interpreting it as best you can. So using video context for clues is, of course, very helpful, or listening to preceding and following utterances. So often the child is either repeating something the adult just said, or their next utterance will make it clearer, or the adult in the context will figure out what they're saying and will say that in their next utterance. And also plan strategies to reduce frustration on the part of the transcriber, like having a maximum number of times that you listen to the passage before moving on, or having a code that marks a thing as uninterpretable or something that you come back to later. So thinking in advance about what strategies you want to use for that are very helpful. And if your transcription resources are limited, like in Lucy's case, for example, then think about ways to reduce time and cognitive load, like advanced segmentation, removing repetitions from first pass transcription, providing motivation, like the situation that I described for Inuktitut, etc. Okay, that's all I want to say about segmentation. Does anyone want to jump in with other tips or questions?
I have a
Marie?
question. Yeah, would you recommend annotating, having a line for a tier for the utterance and then a tier that is dependent on the utterance for intonation units, like having both? Or is it impossible? Or I don't know. I'm working with intonation. Sorry.
I think it depends on your research questions. So I think for myself and my research questions that are mostly around morphosyntax, I think that would be a waste of my time, because I don't think it would be helpful. But you said you're working with intonation. So
intonation units, yeah.
So,
but then I thought maybe I can't calculate the mean length of utterance. So my idea was, well, then I will add a tier in which I group intonation units in utterances.
yeah. So that might be helpful. I've never worked with intonation units, so I don't know how crucially different they are from utterances. Does anybody who's worked with intonation units have insight into that?
I would guess you'd need 2 files per sound recording, because if you're segmenting chat, for example, you cannot segment twice for one utterance. If you're doing like let's say the father speaking, you have to give the utterance or the intonation unit one time point. So, but I mean the rest I think is the same. The other tiers for morphology or IP are going to be the same regardless whether it's intonation or utterance. But I think you'd need 2 chat files, one where segmentation is intonation, one where segmentation is utterance.
Okay,
I
yeah, then.
don't think it's possible to have both in one
I
class.
was thinking of Elan, and
Maybe.
I
Yeah.
wondered whether I think that might be possible in Elan, but I didn't know if
Yeah,
anyone tried.
it is. It is. You'd want to have the utterance tier higher up in the like the prime hierarchy, the top one, and then you can absolutely have the intonation units in the next.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well,
It
thanks.
is tedious to reorganize, but worth it if you want to calculate those things.
Okay,
Thanks.
cool. Other questions, comments? Okay, then let's move on to our last section, which is what tiers to select for transcribing and annotating. So the potential tiers, obviously the most important one is the transcription of the utterance, probably in the standard orthography of the language. We can't do anything without that. And then we recommend a translation into the national language or English or whatever is going to make sense. And then probably not in the first pass, but at some point, morphemic breakdown and gloss and part of speech in order to do the analyses, because they're a lot of them are based on that. And then optional tiers, depending on your own project. Something that makes a lot of sense is the interpretation of the child utterance, especially with younger kids. They don't necessarily include all the morphemes that adult would. So having many people have a tier where they put the interpretation of what an adult would have, how an adult would have said the same thing. Another option is to have a tier where you have errors or childlike productions or differences from the likely target. So some notes about that rather than putting what the actual target is. Having the addressee is a good idea because some of your analyses might depend on whether an utterance, an adult utterance was addressed to a child or to someone else. For example, having notes tier for comments or situational context, or I don't know if this is an error, or the toilet flushed so I couldn't hear anything, or whatever, something like that is very helpful. Then phonetic transcription could be helpful, but only do that if you're going to use it because it's a lot of work. And then obviously annotation for structures of interest. But I would say, well, here's some helpful tips. Create a tier template for each utterance that in chat, it would be difficult to go back and, well, I don't know, difficult, but you'd have to go back and enter for each utterance new tier, which I guess you could do. But if you know from the beginning a set of tiers, then you can create a template and just cut and paste it. In Elan, maybe it's easier to just add a tier across the whole thing. Okay. For the first pass, we strongly suggest just doing the orthographic transcription and maybe a translation, depending. Just that will likely take at least 1 hour per 5 minutes of recording. So that's quite a lot. And you want to get something done and feel a sense of accomplishment. If you try to do every single tier for every utterance as you're going, it will feel like a lot of work. You may want to, in this pass, also include the interpretation of the child utterance, especially if you're sitting with the mother while you're doing it, and the addressee, which is obviously not very much work, and any notes, but you could add that stuff later. And then gradually add information for other tiers as you need them. Also, only use the tiers or information you need for your own questions and analyses. Don't imagine, oh, somebody in the future may want to look at argument structure, so I better code all of argument structure. It's going to take you months to code argument structure. And if you're not using it for your research questions, leave that for the next person if they want to do it. Do minimal annotations for the entire 5 hours, and then do more detailed annotation for either just parts of the 5 hours, like instead of all 30 minutes for each child, maybe 10 minutes for each child, or for a specific phenomenon. So again, this totally depends on your research questions. And different people can do different tiers based on their expertise. So you can use the mother or a community member for transcription, but then have a research assistant do the morphemic breakdown and gloss. They may be easier to find and have more time. So those are some ideas. And now we have several examples from real projects of the tiers people used. So Lucy, maybe you can talk us through this one.
Sure. So you can see in the box on the right, this is a list of the tiers that we have so far. We're still actually doing the sketch, full disclosure. So practical orthography, I'm not sure who came up with that name, but the way the language is spelt in the community. Free translation, transcription notes, which I will be honest, we really use a lot. I think we overuse. So some of the things we put on transcription notes, we are going to put into a separate tier, and in Elan, that is easy to do as long as you don't mind going back and fixing it up. It's quite simple. Addressee, phonological notes, just for the focus children, not a phonetic transcription because of time factors and because we're not sure that we'll need that. Addressee just for the adult speech. We tried to do it for the kids, but just found that there were too many instances where it wasn't clear who the child was addressing. For the adults, we put whether adult-directed speech and the person, or child-directed speech and the person. Morphemic breakdown, gloss, part of speech, notes, which we include contextual notes about the recording or the situation, and anything else really. But it's quite it's for it's transcription notes is for the particular utterance. The notes tier is for the recording. And the last one is not a tier, but whenever I show pictures of Elan with the files that I've used, people always or someone always asks what the little asterisks are for. So I just thought I'd put it here to avoid the question. It's what we did for unclear speech. So you can see here, Acacia is talking about Weet-Bix. So my Weet-Bix are there. This is one of many iterations of her using the word Weet-Bix. And she didn't actually, so this is possibly a bit contentious, for certain nouns that we're sure that the children actually said. So this is one of numerous iterations, and she says it quite clearly before this. We put the word, so she didn't actually, in this utterance, she didn't say Weet-Bix, she said Pit-Pick. So with verbs, we don't do this. For nouns that we were very, very clear about, and I'm not suggesting this is best practice, but it's good for discussion. And then in the phonological notes, we put what the child actually said. This is only when we're really sure that that is what they're saying. Down the bottom the top section, but for Adam, it says in the transcription notes for Adam, LT unsure, and then tarawa, come on. So this is Adam's mother. So I've put unclear speech for Adam because it's just uninterpretable. His mother is unsure, but offers this option of like, maybe he's saying tarawa, come on. So I've put that in the transcription notes. And then in the section at the bottom, you can see the gloss of that utterance. And we segmented in utterances. So that is Elan plus Toolbox. So the glossing that you see at the bottom has been exported from Toolbox. And then on the next slide, here you've got an example of, so in the highlighted text. So this is an adult, Tanya. She is, so the addressee, CDS, so child-directed speech, she's talking to Emily, her daughter. In the notes section, they are talking about a bird in the tree, and then also Pulu Pulu is the nickname and totem of Emily's older brother. So important contextual notes that we need to know for this part of the recording. That's in the notes tier. I also wrote in the transcription notes for Tanya, him. The him in the utterance is referring to the bird. So just so it's easy for if I'm looking at it, for someone else looking at it. And then for Emily, next to that, she presumably tries to produce the utterance that her mother is prompting her to do. So her mother is saying, say to him, blah, 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 blah. Say to him, what are you calling out for? But it's clear that she says tangono and aikayu, that those morphemes, aikai of the verb, are very clear. So we put that there, but we couldn't rely, it's not reliable what she said before. The in the phonological notes section, that is impressionistically, so not Pratt related, what she produced. And she's probably trying to emulate what her mother said, but we can't put that in the practical orthography tier because we can't hear her produce that. In the notes, you can see this very, very overly used here. So we're saying there are lots of prompts in the Murimpata data. So we're saying if a child's utterance is prompted by someone else, we're actually going to take that out of the transcription notes tier and put it in a separate tier. So we're going to have a prompted tier. And then also the note that there's similar number of syllables and also the same melody as the adult's utterance just before, but we can't put that verb up in the top tier. And then below that, you can see that I think aesthetically it is not as nice as Toolbox, but this is the export from Fieldworks, but it works. All the information is there. So you've got the glossing of Tanya, the mother's utterance, down below and that's from Fieldworks. So it does look different, at least the way that we exported it. I think that is all I wanted to say about that.
Great. Super. That's really helpful to see how this actually looks in practice. Okay, our next example is from Mongolian. This is from my doctoral student, and he's just at the beginning of his project. So he's focusing on just transcribing in Mongolian for the child and the mother. And the numbers you see after are the audio timestamps that link to the audio down below here. So he's transcribing in sonic mode of chat, and then he'll add other tiers later on, but at the moment he's just focusing on getting through the data, through the transcription with basic orthography. And then the next example is from Berber. Abdul, can you talk us through this?
Yes, so this is, if I remember, a almost 2 years old child with his mom taking care of mint plants. So yeah, you can see the mother tier. So one thing I did, which I probably should remove or maybe keep, is you can see hyphens in the orthographic tier. But this is something I did just to prepare the transcriptions for the assistants. So for the IPA transcription, I wanted them to follow some rules, and I just pointed to those rules using hyphens. I don't recommend doing this, but yeah. Now that we're talking about this, maybe I should point it out. If you have transcribers, they probably maybe not experts on phonology or whatever. You need to take into consideration the characteristics of the language you're working on, and yeah, just make it easy for them to transcribe. So you can see the more line in there, the phone line. So that's the IPA transcription, and the sonic mode, video mode. So everything is there. Yeah, I think that's pretty much it.
Right. Maybe one thing to point out here is that on the more line, you see the part of speech, the verb, and this is the morpheme. So that's the morphemic breakdown. And then I'm guessing is an imperative. So that's the gloss. So all that information is integrated together on one tier, whereas in ELAN, those would be, I think, 3 separate tiers that are hierarchically related. And so creating this kind of coding system or annotation system could be more work for chat, especially for language like for English. It does this all for you, but for most of the languages you're working with, you'll have to create it yourself. And so this might be more work than doing it in ELAN.
Shanley?
Yeah.
I think you can create using a clan, you can create a min-more which is like an ad hoc lexicon using all the different words that you have in your transcription, and then you can map the morphological information using the more command, so it's not as tedious as it sounds. You code the information once, and then you can add to the list if you have new words, and then it can map the information automatically to all the transcriptions that you have. And the more you see a word used, then it's better because it does it automatically.
I did mine for
I've used it.
before more existed, so I had to create all this myself, but I used then an automatic program with XY, right? That doesn't exist anymore. Now we use Atom, that semi-automate, like we have like a dictionary of all of the different morphemes, and then it can look at a word and suggest segmentation for you. And so you definitely need something like that when you get to the point of morphological glossing. Maybe we should have another session on that. Abdul,
so I used it for Hebrew, I used it for Arabic and for Georgian, and it works fine. I mean, it's only a one-time effort, but then it's worth your while.
Okay. All right. I see we're a little bit over time here, but I'd like to just look at these slides since then we'll finish off this unit. Okay, so I'm going to go to the next one. This is Inuktitut, and this is the whole set of tiers I use. So English, morphology, coding tier for verbs, and argument structure tier, errors, time point, the sound length, addressee, situation, and comments. And you see here the morphological coding thing that I created that does not conform to the current version of More, so don't follow the way I did it. And then various coding that's also not hierarchically related. So that's why there's all of these colons in between, but probably we should have another session on this. Okay, so that's Inuktitut. Here is the font extension in Cree that integrates Praat. So I believe Praat is here on the bottom. And so this is a version of Chat that looks much fancier than the version I used. But you can see here the orthographic transcription in Cree, the morpheme meaning and type and translation. And then this is the link to the audio and video segment. And then they have the IPA of the actual utterance, of the target utterance, the morphology of the actual utterance and the target utterance. And then this is from a project on passives. So they illustrated here the passives coding tier and a notes tier about passives and a general notes tier. So that is how this looks like. And this is taken from the font section of TalkBank. This is also an utterance for Cree. So you see here the IPA transcription of the actual utterance and the target utterance. This is the orthography of what the child said with the morpheme divisions with the tildes. And then the morpheme breakdown of the actual utterance and target utterance, and the meaning and type of morphemes and the translation. So you can transcribe in IPA, but it's a huge, huge amount of work. So only do that if you really want that. And then this is an example from Kaket in Elan, and you see all of the different tiers listed here. They are pretty much the tiers that we've been talking about already, and you see how they look. This looks very similar to Lucy's example. So they have a separate tier for the interpretation of the child utterance, for example, and they have a free translation into both English and Tok Pisin, which is the local larger national language. So this is, I'll show you now the same example in Elan and in Toolbox. the exact same example where you can a little bit more clearly see the free, the utterance, the interpretation, the free translation in English and Tok Pisin, and then the morpheme breakdown and glosses. It's all clearly aligned here. And this is the same example in chat format. So you see the difference between here, everything is hierarchically aligned, and here, everything is all on one tier. Okay, so those are some examples of tiers that are used for transcribing, and the tiers that you need to be thinking about as you're preparing to process your data. And I think that is all that I have to say. And so now I don't know how to get out of this. Okay. There, I think that I can stop sharing. Did I stop sharing already? No? Okay, maybe you can stop me sharing. Thank you. Great. Okay, so that is everything I wanted to say. Do people have more questions or comments or want to add anything or no?
I'll add one tiny thing about transcription. I actually found, as tedious as it is and arduous as it was a really, really positive thing. And I learned so much from the women I worked with, because you're sitting there talking about what's happening in the recording. And I just got so much amazing contextual, ethnographic sort of cultural information. And it was actually mostly really fun. I made sure that for the repetitive parts, we didn't do that. Like I planned ahead, and so there was just one example of the billion demands for water or something, for example, and so we were just listening to one. Yeah, it can be a really great thing, but it's very slow.
So our next session is supposed to be about transcription, and so that would be great if we come with examples like that of how we can make that transcription is a whole process through which we learn a lot, and how we can make it easier. Okay, bye, Dara. Thank you for coming. Any last questions before we finish?
I have a small comment as well. I think I agree with Lucy first. Even as a speaker of the language, I gain a lot of metalinguistic knowledge, as you do, especially if you work with the MOL line. Another thing, I think maybe we should try to make a case for like whether you should choose Elan route or the chat route. I think chat's biggest advantage is compatibility, if you want an ease of converting to other formats, but also maybe I should say that it's sometimes unstable. It makes you go nuts. Sometimes it will not save your progress. Sometimes, one time I had almost finished a transcript of 2,000 utterances, and suddenly all the speakers are annotated as sister. So all the utterances were spoken by sister, and I could not undo that. It was changed and saved, so I had to go again and change to mother, to sister, to brother, and check who said what. Yeah, that was kind of discouraging. The other one I think is the analysis stage. So the clan commands are also a pain. It's a steep learning curve. If you want to know, if you want to learn, they have a bit of a strange coding method to do things. If you want to analyze in clan. So after the chat stage, after the transcription. So maybe we should save that for the analysis lecture.
Okay. Yeah. Sounds good. That's very helpful. That hasn't happened to me with clan.